Good morning. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Rihab Khalifa, and I will be part of the discussion today on how we can help empower women in Sudan post revolution time. The title of my talk today will be Gender Responsive Budgeting, and the entire focus will be on how do we take to the national agenda and also to the local agendas within councils and even non-governmental organizations the theme of gender responsive budgeting. I would like to limit my talk to less than 15 minutes or so, but pardon me if I run a little bit over. The purpose and the outline of the talk is below. So I'm going to start by overviewing gender responsive budgets. I'm going to explain some basic terms and also reflect briefly on some of the methods that are used to do gender responsive budgets. And I'm going to take a couple of examples to show how can they be useful. And I will conclude my talk by recommending a couple of things to take forward in relation to gender responsive budgets. Budgets are fairly known, and basically we can define them as an estimate of income or expenditure for a set period of time, and often that period of time is about 1 year. There are different types of budgets depending on their functionalities, depending on the time span that they run over, depending on how flexible they are. But for the purposes of today's talk, we're going to focus on governmental budgets. And again, it's more or less the same definition. But if we want to go for a formal definition of what a governmental budget is, we can say that is a comprehensive statement from the government reflecting planned revenue and expenditure within a financial year. So it's slightly different in the sense that it has to show us the collective government view of where they think they will collect the revenues from and where they're going to spend the money that they have generated. Often that is announced once a year. The good thing about any budget analysis that one can run is that it basically exposes issues. What you see in front of you is just a basic, simple representation of money coming in and money going out, and it's for the government of the UK. And so, if one is looking for a very simple answer to a question about how much does the government spend on health, and did that go up or down, you can look at a simple graphical representation like the one you see now. Talking about gender budgeting, though, we are focusing that analysis to the level of women, children, and those marginalized. And so they go by different names. One of the names is gender-sensitive budgeting. You can call them women's budgets. And if I want to go for a formal definition that people would recognize as they go through this is we can say it's a systematic process to analyze the mainstream government budget to ensure that those priorities as specified by the government in terms of expenditures and also these projected revenues address the various needs and contributions of men and women. And by default, when we talk about women, we also talk about the groups that are concerned or related to them mainly as per the economy basically situation. We're talking about caretaking. So we are focusing also on children and the marginalized, like the elderly, and so on and so forth. And so this is one of these caricatures that I really like because I think in a nutshell, it really shows us that the flow of money is not unlimited. It's really quite limited. And in so many ways, governments and individuals and organizations have to make decisions about where they spend their money. And often the ramifications of those budget cuts, if we have to go down that line, affect women more and the marginalized groups and also children if we're not aware of where these cuts are coming from. And so just to give you a quick background and brief history about where gender responsive budgets came from, I can say that mostly that came with the advent of NGOs operating in developing countries. And one of the key questions that they often asked were related to the issue of how does the money that we give to these entities within developing countries impact those groups that are most in need of this expenditure. So, for example, women and children. There are sort of various ways to conceptualize where it came from, but one can also see different budget groups that originated in different parts of the world. So Australia was one of these countries that pioneered this. There is also the Women's Budget Initiative in South Africa. And currently, if you look at the landscape of gender responsive budgeting, there's a large number of women or gender budget initiatives worldwide. So it's not really limited as it used to be in the past. Why gender responsive budgets? I can always contrast them with what we call gender blind budgets or neutral budgets or budgets as they are known in the normal world of people who do budgeting. So gender blind budgets or neutral budgets normally ignore the different impacts on men and women because the roles, responsibilities, and capacities in any society are never the same. So if I do not take that as a guiding principle when I design my sources of income and where I'm going to spend my money, I have disadvantaged some group in some way or another. And they are a very important tool to analyze the gap between the expressed commitments of the government or by the government and the decision-making processes involved in how they devolve these budgets. And so, for example, if the government says that we really aim to empower women, and then I look at the budget items and I can see that most of the revenue is generated from groups such as women, for example, by heavily taxing particular industries because they work there, and the money is not spent really on women and children, it's a really clear breach of that promise. And so it's a really good way to hold governments responsible, but also hold civil society organizations that donate money at a different level, not only to the government. There are various tools that deal with gender responsive budgets. And so they vary from the level of a wider analysis in terms of I look at the budget overall and I can see basically these are issues to be brought forward, or we can also delve into the very details, the nitty-gritty analysis of where the money is coming from and how it's spent. And so there are different applications and different uses for them. We're not going to go through this today, and I have to emphasize that part of the talk today is to basically just bring to the forefront this issue of gender responsive budgets. Given the short span of the time that I have and my absence there, it will not be easy to explain how they work in great detail. But I'll give a couple of examples just to bring this topic to the in terms of literature, there are quite a few sort of angles one can look at. So feminist and gender studies have discussed gender responsive budgets. Developmental studies have really a great wealth of documenting the experiences of when they have applied that. Social policy, public sector management. Economics have been also a leading force in terms of analyzing these kind of analyzing these kind of expenditures and revenues in relation to gender. And more recently, accounting I'm a professor in accounting, so since about 2008, 2007, I really had a lot of interest in that, and I became a member of a couple of women budget groups. I'll give a very brief, quick example with how gender analysis can enable us to look at how the government are committing to what they're promising. So this is an example from Sri Lanka. It's basically about disaggregating the time that is spent by Sri Lankan men and women on different activities. And they range from food preparation to preserving food for the hungry, producing, fetching water, collecting firewood. And if I look at that, I mean, it's really clearly obvious that most of the care-taking activities time is used by women. Just look at the percentages. Maybe the highest percentage of time spent by men on this table is storing grain at harvest time. And this is in rural Sri Lanka. And I don't think this picture is really greatly different from any other context in the developing world. And so if I look at something like that, and I want to ask the question, so how does that really help me in looking at how I spend my money or what I earn it? Gender responsive budgets or gender budgets highlight the importance of time for poor people. So by default, if I find that a lot of the time is spent by women to fetch water, take care of the elderly, I would worry about certain things like transport to get them from A to B. And I'm going to look at how much money is being spent by the government for transportation. So often the question is, how could the information on time use inform government policy For example, setting poverty line based on income required for survival. When we do that, we have to know and we have to take into account the time available for income earning work. Also, decisions on health services and public transport expenditure, often they affect women more than men. Or carers, let's put it that way. So we're not really making the distinction between it's men versus women, but let's use the general category caretakers who happen to often be women. UNDP reports have shown that in every country, women spend more hours than men in work, and work here is defined as paid and unpaid. If I want to put it in different terms, we can call it productive and reproductive, even though I really have some reservations about these labels. So I found really this interesting map that talks about the percentage of national populations living on less than 1.25 per day dollars. And if I look at something like that and I try and link it to gender responsive budgeting, it becomes a lot clearer that if I don't take into account that these people with less income have to spend quite a bit of their time doing particular activities, I will not be able to allocate my budget in a way that will help them get out of the poverty line. Talking about Sudan as one of the examples of countries that should adopt gender responsive budgets, given that it has a huge population that is below the poverty line, and women do face certain issues in relation to caretaking activities, and how is that supported by public expenditure. And so if there are questions that are to be asked about gender responsive budgets in the Sudan, I think one of the key questions would be, what roles do budgets, federal and non-federal, sort of serve in Sudan in relation to women? Also the question of, are there any clearly stated policies in these budgets? So if I see a government budget like the Sudan, does that tell me clearly what are the policies that are sort of being followed or targeted by the government in terms of expenditure and revenue? And from that, it basically follows, to what extent do these stated policies affect women and children and those marginalized or sort of, sort of the needy groups? And so the question is, I have a policy stated. Does the policy clearly link or clearly affect those women and children? And is there any congruence between those budget allocations and the government stated policies? So in simple terms, for example, if I see that there is a particular need for an expenditure item, and the government went even ahead and identified that, the question is, have they really put their money where their mouth is? Have they really put the money where that need is? And this is where the issue of congruence between budget allocations and government stated policies need to be really scrutinized clearly. And also, what is the feedback loop mechanisms that affect the formulation of future budgets? So it's not only important that we do have a budget, it has clearly stated policies, that those policies have a clear and we have a clear understanding about how they affect women, and that those policies are in line with the stated sort of intentions of the government as expressed in their policies, in their objectives. But also, do we have any feedback mechanisms that will affect future budgets that the government might come with? Looking at Sudan, a budget is issued by the powers and the functions of the Ministry of Finance, Economics, Planning Ministry, and their mandate is to introduce techniques and modern tools in preparing and managing public budget systems. It's a big statement, it's massive. I'm not really sure to what extent we have actually, as a country, delivered on that, given that I cannot even simply find the budget of the country for the last 3 years. And this is really quite frightening. Budgets must be approved in the Sudan by the parliament. There's a link that I provided there in the presentation if you want to see sort of the Ministry of Finance mandate on how they relate to budget. The last one that I've looked at was the 2015-2016 budget, and the theme for that budget was basically production for export and improving the standard of living. It was stated simply as that. If you go to the first page, I think, of the budget, or I think it's where the policies are, and I have a list of them later, they talk about this as the theme for that cycle. The cycle runs for about 5 years, and I think it starts in 2016. These are the objectives of the year 2015 budget of Sudan. There are about 11 of them. Just looking at those 11 objectives, I tried to highlight which ones of them would be clearly related to women and children. And I managed to come about two. I can really have a long, lengthy discussion about if the other ones contribute or not and to what extent and so on and so forth. But from the outset, this is what I can actually explicitly. Preliminary reflections, and I call them preliminary because I am not providing here any in-depth analysis of the budgets in terms of it being gender responsive or not. But just looking at it from the outset, I can say that the absence of sort of the lack of availability of data is really quite staggering. So it's hard to even see and judge what happened in the last few years in terms of expenditure on women and children. In the 2016 budget, I did a quick sort of search. I found that women were mentioned about 3 times in 3 areas. You will find them on the stated financial and monetary policy, which is a great thing. So they talk about increasing resources of direct support to poor families, poor people advocacy, and so on and so forth. Women and children are listed as part of that. It's good in a way that they're there, but yet they're a subcategory just like everyone else within the stated policy. You also find them interestingly twice, and it's only relating to health. They talk about productive health, so it's women and the newborn, and they talk about the protection of women from breast cancer. Gender, I sort of did another quick look for gender. Gender is mentioned also about twice, and it's often linked to, or actually, I think at least in one of these 2 times, it was linked to some initiatives by UN agencies, like the government was expecting some revenue concerning some issues to do with women. I just have to say here to clarify that the use of the words gender and women is not necessarily a good measure to see if a government is sort of spending or analyzing its budget in relation to gender needs. However, it's a very quick sort of look and analysis in terms of where is it there? Is it stated clearly? Are they explicitly referencing links to women and children or not? Children are not really an exception to the basic analysis I've talked about there. And so just looking at, and I've sort of, I will provide a link to the document, you can have a look at it. If I look at the way budget is portrayed, and this is not untypical of accounting representations of women within things like budgets, but I can say that women are portrayed within government budgets, in particular with Sudan budget, as consumers, and they're not really seen as productive agents. They only come up in expenditure section. There's no reference to their contribution to the revenue of the country, and so it's really quite interesting in that sense that they are seen as consumers of services that are provided by the government. The focus also is really intriguing because it's often actually the only focus I can see explicitly there is in their reproductive role. So we're talking about breast cancer, reproductive health. A significant portion of the funding that comes regarding these issues come through developmental international agencies. So this is another question. I'm doing some research and auditing with non-governmental organizations in different parts of the developing world. And it's really quite intriguing that donors do not often follow where the money that have invested go in. They're very happy to receive an audit report from a country or a company, and that's where it ends. And so, again, this is a different topic, but it's also quite related to what we're talking about here. So where do we start? If you want to start gender responsive budgets, where do we start? If you want to do this in Sudan, there are 5 core stages. First stage is to understand those needs that are different between men and women, boys and girls, elderly and the marginalized in the Sudan, and in all sectors. Talking about health, education, the legal system, we need to really get a glimpse and a better understanding of what their needs are. We also need to ask the government of Sudan to clearly state the country's policy objectives. And as they do so, as they articulate the policy objectives, we need to ensure that these actually address the needs of those different groups. We don't stop there because we don't always expect governments to do what we ask them for, but there should be a way to analyze those objectives to determine if they take into account those issues related to gender and the marginalized. Following that, now we actually go and follow the money. We find out and we examine the expenditure and the revenue to see whether they are allocated to areas that maximize benefits to women and children. And to keep this cycle going, it's really quite important that we regularly lobby the government to readjust its expenditure and revenues according to those needs. So if you want to think of this as a sort of general plan to how we apply gender responsive budgets, we can say that it starts from understanding the needs, asking the government of Sudan to clearly state those country policy objectives and make sure that these needs are embedded within there. We need then to come and analyze if we're delivering on those objectives, seeing where the money is going to and where we're generating the revenues from, and also continue to lobby the government to readjust expenditure and revenues according to these needs. And we need to keep in mind that these needs might be changing and definitely will be changing. And so we can say that it's almost a dialectical way of looking at this relationship. There is sort of the top-down part of it where we have to lobby the government to use gender responsive budgets as a planning tool. And the government itself should hold its constituents and local authorities, for example, accountable for sound implementation of these policies that they come up with. But at the same time, there should be some pressure exerted from the bottom up. So the needs for women, children, and the marginalized, like the elderly, for example, or certain minority groups in the community, they need to be identified from at the grassroots level. This is not something that you can look at it from a macro level. So here the role of organizations and civic organizations becomes really important, of course, in collaboration with government and local authorities, but we need to identify women, children, and the marginalized needs and assess them regularly. And at the same time, we need to hold governments accountable via parliament and civic society organizations. And here we're talking, of course, about the government of Sudan. And so if these two if these two do not really work well in tandem, we will struggle to have a good way to redirect or reorient our expenditures and revenues to the benefit of women and the marginalized. So policy recommendations, if there are a couple of things I would like to say by the end of this talk is to say that at the governmental level, the government, in particular the Ministry of Finance, need to have gender mainstreaming as one of its key objectives, and it needs to reflect on its policies in relation to health, education, and other sectors. Civil society organizations and women activist groups should form pressure groups to analyze government expenditure and revenues in relation to gender. And when I say this, I really extend an invitation to all those who are interested in this to form a group. And I think it would be really lovely if by the end of this workshop, at least we identify a couple of key people who can deal with gender responsive budgets, and they can relate this to all sectors that are currently being discussed. I think this is just a short bio about me for those who would like to know in which ways I can help. I have my email there. Please do let me know if I can be of more help. Thank you very much for listening, and I really wish you a successful and fruitful workshop.